Friday seminar or the quarter. I'm Kelly Clifton, a faculty member in civil engineering. Today we have one of our own, Alex Bigazzi, presenting his master's thesis work on looking at can congestion mitigation policies improve air quality. And I just want to make a reminder, this is the last seminar of the term, and so you owe to either me or Dr. Glebe either your journals or your paper by June 7th. So email those to either of us. So don't forget to do that. And I'll pass around the sign-in sheet. And just again, before we start, the weekly reminder to please use your microphone when asking questions so that people can listening remotely can hear your important comments. Take it away, Alex.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you all for being here. I realize I'm competing with the first sunny, warm day we've had in a while, so I appreciate you guys coming into a room where we've actually blocked out any possibility of sunlight getting in. So my name is Alex Bigazzi. I've been working in the research lab here on campus for about 3 or 4 years. And the presentation I'm going to give today is looking at the relationships between congestion and emissions. This was motivated for me by hearing various people involved in the transportation sector citing emissions reductions as an implicit co-benefit from congestion mitigation. And you hear this association a lot between congestion and emissions, and then often it's emissions reductions are tacked on as a kind of, and this will happen too, without really justifying that assumption. And so I was interested in looking at what are the conditions that are needed for this assumption to hold? So when can we expect emissions co-benefits from congestion mitigation? And then broadly, what role can congestion mitigation play in our air quality and climate change goals? So, and before I go on, I'd like to acknowledge Miguel Filiozzi, who's my advisor here at Portland State University and has helped me a lot with this research over the last couple of years. So that was motivation for me, as a bit of motivation for you all and a bit of context for the talk. If you're not familiar with it, let me introduce you to the CMAQ program, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program. This has been going on for about 20 years, jointly administered by the Federal Highway Administration and the EPA, authorized under the Surface Transportation Acts, and has provided over $14 billion in funding for projects with the dual goals of reducing congestion and improving emissions or improving air quality. And so these are a lot of different projects. These are some demand-side congestion mitigation strategies, some transit improvements, some traffic flow improvements, which are essentially capacity expansions without adding lane miles, so we're increasing throughput, reducing travel times. And so a lot of different projects have been going on with these dual goals in mind. And I mean, just the title of the program itself, you can see that there's a strong association for many years in the US with a lot of funding behind it. But the challenge is that the relationship between congestion and emissions is not clear. It's not a monotonic relationship at all. And there are many influence pathways from congestion to emissions. And so you have immediate roadway impacts related to speed, acceleration, stop-and-go driving, these kinds of things. And you have much broader impacts related to land use, related to freight supply chain logistics, related to people's travel behaviors and mode choice, destination choices, et cetera. So there are a lot of different pathways, a lot of different ways that congestion can influence emissions. And estimating these all in a detailed and unified way is nearly impossible. So typically what's done when you're looking at congestion is people are really only looking at the efficiency and only looking at the roadway level effects. So looking at how congestion, particularly with respect to emissions, how congestion influences travel efficiency per vehicle per mile. All right, but we wanted to look at this in a bigger picture and try and capture some of these more indirect changes. And so I'm not really going to get too much of the methodology here because we have limited time. But some objectives for the talk today is first we're going to look at general relationships between emissions and speed, and then look at some of the expected effects of congestion mitigation and when can we expect emissions co-benefits from that. Look a little bit at the role of trucks because those are very heavy emitters on the roadways, and then look a bit about performance measures, and I'll conclude by suggesting some changes to the way we're looking at congestion effects and the way we think about the relationship between congestion and emissions. So here's the framework, conceptual framework, which also guided the modeling. We have congestion over here, and we're trying to figure out how congestion mitigation or changes in congestion level are going to impact total emissions. And as I said, there are many pathways here, and what we've done is kind of aggregated these. And so you have a top pathway where we're looking at the mechanical effects, and we're looking at the roadway level efficiency changes. And then we have a bottom pathway where we're trying to group a lot of the behavioral responses to congestion. Right? So if you have a congestion mitigation, some change in the level of congestion, it's often reflected by a change in the average travel speed. Right? It's kind of our primary metric is the travel speed. So congestion mitigation increases travel speed, which will tend to increase the operating efficiency of vehicles. You'll have fewer accelerations. You'll have shorter operating times. So with an increase in travel speed, emissions rates will tend to go down, which will tend to decrease total emissions. At the same time, when you've increased the travel speed, you've reduced travel times, you've made roadway travel, you've increased the utility of roadway travel, and you're going to generate some induced demand. It's called some extra vehicle travel as a result of that. So travel volumes tend to go up, and it has the opposite effect. That tends to increase the total emissions from the roadway. So you have these kind of two aggregate pathways that are having counteracting effects to some degree. And so really the question that we're looking at is what is the balance of these two pathways, and will the efficiency benefits from congestion mitigation outweigh the travel volume increases, or will the travel volume increases outweigh the efficiency benefits? In terms of turning that into a modeling framework, the upper path is fairly easy to trace. Maybe easy is a strong word, but there are established methods for doing that. We have several well-established, well-validated emissions models for estimating these in a macroscopic and an aggregate way. We use the MOVES 2010 emissions model, which is the latest mobile source emissions model from the EPA, and a couple other emissions models as well, which you'll see in a moment. So we have analytical ways to estimate how changing travel speeds and changing congestion levels influence total emissions through changing emissions rates. Quantifying these behavioral changes are much more challenging. There's a lot more uncertainty, and there's a lot more parameters and a lot more locality specifics involved in that. One common method is demand elasticity, which perhaps a lot of you are familiar with. It's the general idea that the total travel demand is responsive to changes in the system. And so the travel demand elasticity to speed, we could say, is the net change in vehicle miles traveled with a change in speed. And we use that in a very aggregate way, and we'll use something called the break-even point to look at a range of demand elasticity values, which, again, you'll see how we approach that shortly. So first, getting into the efficiency, the kind of upper path that I described before, here we're looking at an emission speed curve, actually 3 emission speed curves. And this is a very typical relationship you look at in emissions modeling. So on the vertical axis, we have carbon dioxide equivalents, so essentially greenhouse gases. And this is emissions rates per mile of travel. Okay, so this is the efficiency of roadway travel. And on the horizontal axis, we have average speed, which is kind of our congestion indicator. And the dashed vertical lines, which might be a little hard to see back there, but these are indicators from the Highway Capacity Manual of levels of service. So here you have heavy congestion, level of service F, and here you have pretty much free flow speeds, level of service A. And I've put on here 3 different models. The top one is some modeling we did locally using the MOVES 2010 model for Portland. The middle one is a mixed fleet mobile source emissions model from the UK out of 2009. And the third one comes from Southern California, some research they did at UC Riverside, and that's for a light-duty fleet only. So these are 3 very different models modeling different fleets of vehicles on different types of roadways. So we expect the absolute emissions level to be the same. But what we see here is consistently a fairly flat trend. So emissions rates are fairly unresponsive to speed changes for a wide range of moderate speeds, from around 25 miles an hour to 65 miles an hour, depending on what your threshold for flat is. So emissions rates are fairly stagnant at a wide range of moderate speeds. Outside of this, you have rapidly degrading efficiency. So at very high speeds, aerodynamic drag increases greatly, and you have decreasing efficiency. And at very low speeds, you also have decreasing efficiency. And it's this uptick on the bottom part that I think is the cause of a lot of this association we have between congestion and emissions. Because it's true, as congestion gets really bad, emissions rates go way up because travel efficiency goes down. But that's only half the story. That's the upper path. That's the emissions rate path. You also have to look at total, in order to get to total travel, in order to get to total emissions, you also have to look at the travel volume. Right? And that's the changes in the travel volume, which is the bottom path. that's what we're going to integrate here. So here we're looking at total emissions. That's the shading on this plot with the scale on the right. So you have mass emissions per hour per lane mile of roadway. And we've put that on the vertical axis is your average speed, and the bottom axis is essentially your travel demand volume, right, in terms of the flow rate. And the two curves we have on this plot, the solid line is kind of our base case, and these are theoretical relationships between travel demand volume and speed. It comes out of the BPR function, if you're familiar with that. And so we have two different curves. The solid line is our base case, and then the dashed line is what we expect with a 10% capacity increase. So some sort of ITS improvement that we can put 10% more vehicles through. This is a capacity-based congestion mitigation, so as you can see, the speeds tend to go up from the solid line to the dashed line. Okay. And then in terms of total emissions, as we have higher travel demand volume, the total emissions go up, it gets darker, that's what we expect. And then you have lower speeds, the efficiency goes down, and so the emissions go up as we go down in this plot too, right? So as we're going to the bottom right, less efficient, higher volume, the total emissions go up. But let's look at what happens. Let's take an initial case of a right around capacity, 2,200 passenger cars per hour per lane. And if the total demand is fixed, and we increase the capacity 10%, we'll get about a 7% increase in the speed and about a 3% decrease in total emissions. Right? So at a fixed demand, we're seeing emissions benefits from this capacity expansion. But that's an extreme case where travel demand is totally unresponsive to the travel time benefits afforded by the capacity expansion. So on the opposite side, we have another extreme case where travel demand is fully elastic, and all those travel time savings are converted into extra travel, and then we have more travel demand on the facility, and then we'll end up at another equilibrium state with the same average travel speed. So this is the other extreme case, and if we follow that line, the red arrow on the figure, then we'll get a 10% increase in demand, the same efficiency because we'll end up at the same average travel speed, and we'll get a 10% increase in total emissions. So the emissions effect of this capacity expansion depends on the travel behavior response. If we're more towards the red line, total emissions are going to increase. If we're more towards the red arrow. If we're more towards the green arrow, then total emissions are going to decrease because efficiency dominates. Well, it's hard to know exactly where we are. This is kind of an arbitrary roadway with unspecified characteristics. So what is the demand elasticity? It's pretty hard to predict, but what we can do is estimate, or we can actually calculate a break-even demand point. And we could do that by following, so these lines in the shading, we'll call those ISO emissions lines. Right? And these are emissions contour lines, so these are where the total emissions are the same. And if we follow one of these lines up from the first curve to the second curve, we find the point on the new curve where the total emissions are the same. Right? And that's our break-even point, where emissions haven't changed because of the capacity change. And that's at about a 5% increase in speed and a 2% increase in traffic volume. Right? So efficiency has gone up, but the travel demand has gone up a little bit too. But those have balanced each other out here. And if you turn that into demand elasticity, that equates to a demand elasticity of 0.4. We can then go to the literature. Demand elasticities in the literature, with respect to speed, have been estimated in the range typically from 0.2 to 1. Right? So 0.2 is a low elasticity, which is kind of a short-term effect where there's not a lot of choices for the travelers. They're kind of beholden to their routes and their modes, et cetera. Demand elasticity of 1 is a high elasticity where travelers have a lot of options, and they're very responsive to changes in the network. So here we have a value of 0.4, which is fairly low. So we can kind of expect that the demand elasticity is going to be above that, in which case we'll be more towards the red line, and total emissions would increase. In the case that we're below that, and we're between like 0.2 and 0.4, we'll be more towards this green line here, and we expect total emissions to decrease because of this. So what you're looking at is we can use these emissions rates and these emissions calculations to find the break-even elasticity and then see where that fits in the range of expected elasticities to see whether we expect total emissions to go up or go down. And before I move on from this plot, I'd like to point out that this is the result of a capacity expansion approach to congestion mitigation. On the other side, there's also the opportunities for demand-side congestion mitigations. And that's where we don't change the capacity of the roadway. We find some policy measure or some enhancement of alternatives that decreases the travel demand on the roadway. If we do that, we stay on the solid line and we move more towards a lower travel demand volume, and we have the additive benefits of both lower demand volume and increased efficiency. Right? So you have two very different approaches to congestion mitigation. A capacity-based one, we're moving up and to the right, and we're having trade-offs between travel demand volume and efficiency. And then a demand-based approach to congestion mitigation, we're moving up and to the left, and we have emissions benefits on both sides. All right, but moving back to the capacity-based approach, we estimated this break-even point, this break-even demand elasticity, for a range of pollutants in a range of fleets in a range of situations. And here is an example plot. This is, again, for greenhouse gases. And I've plotted all three of the emissions models, which I showed before, the Portland, the UK, and the Southern California one. On the horizontal axis, we have the initial traffic state, so the initial average speed. And on the vertical axis, we have the elasticity of demand to speed. And the curves represent these break-even points. And once again, if our true elasticity is above the break-even point, is above the curve, we expect total emissions to increase. If our true elasticity is below the curve, we expect total emissions to decrease. Now, I'll reiterate, these emissions models are modeling different fleets of vehicles in different countries in very different situations. So we don't necessarily expect them to agree. And actually, it's remarkable how well they do agree in this one area of the curve. There's some departures at the higher speeds. But for many situations amongst these three models, we're in this area here where we expect total emissions to increase. This is for moderate initial speeds, for moderate demand elasticity. We expect total emissions to increase if we enact a capacity expansion. And it's only down here with fairly inelastic travel demand and really low initial average travel speeds that we can expect a total emissions benefit from congestion mitigation. All right. As I said, we did this in a range of situations. We kind of put some qualitative descriptions on them. And we had this, when the break-even demand elasticity is really low, we expect the true elasticity to be higher. So this is kind of not recommended that congestion mitigation, capacity-based congestion mitigation be used as an emissions reduction strategy. And on the opposite end, we have when the break-even elasticity is really high, it's very likely we'll get emissions benefits. So there's good opportunities for capacity-based congestion mitigation to reduce total emissions. All right, so green, good opportunities. Red, probably emissions are going to go up. And you can see these are 5 pollutants: greenhouse gases, carbon monoxide, fine particulates, nitrogen oxides or NOx, and gaseous hydrocarbons. And if we're looking at all pollutants overall, it's really only at these very low initial speeds below 20 miles an hour, which is very slow for a freeway. It's really only down here that we could expect emissions benefits for all these pollutants. Now, fine particulates and hydrocarbons are more sensitive to speed, so there's more areas where those can be reduced through efficiency improvements, right? But the other pollutants, not so much. And this is consistent with some of the results that have come out of case studies from the CMAQ program, is that a lot of times you'll have a congestion improvement and you'll see a reduction in one pollutant, say hydrocarbons, but an increase in another pollutant, say NOx. And so it makes the situation really complicated and quite difficult. But again, a lot of areas that are red here where total emissions are expected to increase with capacity-based congestion mitigation. A quick note on the role of advanced vehicles. Now, we have modeled this for conventional vehicles, for internal combustion engines, and there's a big push towards hybrid electric vehicles, fuel cells, et cetera. And advanced drivetrain vehicles are much less sensitive to congestion than traditional vehicles. For various reasons, they have regenerative braking, so they can recapture a lot of the energy of stop-and-go driving. They can eliminate idling, and so when they're at traffic lights on arterials, or if they're in really heavy freeway congestion, they don't get those idling emissions. Adaptive cruise control can smooth out the speeds a little bit. So advanced vehicles are becoming less sensitive to congestion. The emission speed curves are becoming more flat. And as a result, there's fewer efficiency benefits to be had based on decreasing congestion or increasing the average speeds. And what that means from the previous slide is that you're going to see a lot more red in that figure as our vehicles advance and as our sensitivity to congestion goes down. So more advanced fleets, fewer opportunities for emissions reductions through congestion mitigation. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of trucks, because trucks are heavy emitters and they play a big role in the total roadway emissions, as you'll see shortly. Now, when I say trucks, contrary to that slide, I don't mean passenger trucks. So we're talking about medium and heavy-duty trucks, gross vehicle weight rating of 14,000 pounds or more. So first, let's look at emissions rates. So this is the ratio of heavy-duty emissions rates versus light-duty emissions rates, normalized per vehicle mile of travel. the big emissions coming out of the heavy-duty fleet are in fine particulates and NOx. PM, particulate matter, emissions reach levels of almost 60 times light-duty emissions rates per vehicle mile. Now, this is not just because of the shape and the weight of the vehicle. This is also because in the US, the heavy-duty vehicles are dominated by diesel fuels, whereas our light-duty fleet is dominated by gasoline. So part of this is because of vehicle body differences, engine differences, and part of it is because of fuel differences. But much higher emissions rates for PM and NOx from the heavy-duty fleet than the light-duty fleet. Also, by the downward sloping trends of these curves, you can see that heavy-duty vehicles are more sensitive to congestion. Right? So as congestion sets in, their emissions rates go up more proportionally than do light-duty vehicles' emissions rates. Now, look, how does that impact their role in the total picture? Here we're assuming heavy-duty vehicles are about 10% of the fleet, which is fairly typical on, say, I-5. So if heavy-duty vehicles are 10% of the fleet, here's the fraction of total emissions that are coming from that sector, from those 10% of the vehicles. And we see 85, 90% of the particulates are coming from just these 10% heavy-duty vehicles. About 70% of the NOx are coming from them. Almost half of the hydrocarbons are coming from them. So a lot of the local pollutants are coming from heavy-duty vehicles. Again, these curves are sloping down, so we also know that heavy-duty vehicles are more sensitive to congestion. What that means, we go back to the break-even demand elasticity for a moment, is that there's a point. These are the break-even point. The break-even elasticities for heavy-duty vehicles is the dashed line, and for light-duty vehicles is the solid line. Because heavy-duty vehicles tend to be more sensitive, the line is higher up here, and so there's a point between these curves. There's a region between these curves when we expect heavy-duty emissions to go down, but light-duty emissions to go up because of capacity-based congestion mitigation. So all these sensitivities have led to suggestions for class-based strategies to reduce emissions. Right? And this is not just for emissions motivators. There's a lot of other reasons. There are also differences in terms of the value of time and mobility needs. But there are certainly opportunities for class-based traffic management strategies to reduce emissions better than just general-purpose traffic management strategies. And so here I present results from kind of a sketch analysis study using a typical three-lane freeway, looking at 4 different ways to manage these 3 lanes. So TOL is a truck-only lane, so it's a lane dedicated for heavy-duty vehicles. And then general purpose is a mixed light-duty, heavy-duty facility. So for these three lanes, we have 4 possible strategies. The first is a truck-only lane conversion. So we take away one of the general purpose lanes and replace it with a truck-only lane. So we have 2 general purpose lanes and a truck-only lane. The second one is just adding a 4th lane and making that a truck-only lane. The third one is adding a general purpose lane, so then we'll have 4 general purpose lanes. And the 4th one is removing a general purpose lane, and we go down to 2 general purpose lanes. It turns out that for all 5 pollutants, in general, the better strategy is a class-based approach. So we're using some sort of a division of light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles. And this is just based on the emissions results due to speed changes. This isn't looking at some of the more microscopic interactions in terms of vehicle spacing. So although it is taking into account the passenger car equivalents. So if you're looking at adding a lane, adding a truck-only lane, it provides more emissions benefits than adding a general purpose lane for all 5 pollutants. Converting one of the general purpose lanes to a truck-only lane has the most benefits for most of the pollutants because we're providing efficiency benefits to the vehicles that need them most, that can benefit, not need them most, that can most benefit from them, the heavy-duty vehicles. Here with the truck-only lane conversion, we're decreasing congestion for heavy vehicles. We're actually increasing congestion for light-duty vehicles a bit, but for light-duty vehicles, the emissions sensitivity to speed is not as great as it is for heavy-duty vehicles. Again, this is kind of a sketch-level analysis. Now, you notice removing a general purpose lane, we've increased congestion for everybody, right? This suppresses some travel demand, assuming that travel time increases has the reverse effect of travel time decreases, which provides total emissions benefits for the pollutants that are less sensitive to speed, but increased emissions for the pollutants that are more sensitive to speed, right? Because efficiency has gone way down here. We've also suppressed a little bit of demand. One more comment on that is that truck-only lane conversion is kind of an opportunity for, this general purpose lane removal, some people refer to as a road diet, which is pretty politically infeasible in many locations, is removing a general purpose lane. Truck-only lane conversion kind of provides an opportunity for selective mobility where you can get support from some road users for managing our capacity a little bit differently, because obviously we're providing efficiency, not just emissions efficiency, but mobility benefits to the heavy-duty vehicles. Okay, so moving on from the role of trucks, I'm going to look a little bit at performance measures. So Joe Courtwright, I think it was this term, gave an interesting presentation looking at the concepts of mobility in the Urban Mobility Report. And some of this comes out of that research and draws on that research, and it certainly relates to it. So we made some rough sketch-level estimates using the same emissions models of total emissions, total peak period emissions for all the cities in the Urban Mobility Report, using the Urban Mobility Report base data related to the amount of travel and the speeds, et cetera. And what we're interested in is how well do our congestion metrics reflect our emissions trends. Excuse me. And we're interested in that because, as we've shown before, congestion has a not a monotonic relationship with emissions, right? So changing congestion levels can either increase or decrease emissions. So that led to this question of how well do congestion and emissions performance measures tie into each other. So here we're looking at a time series for Portland. And we're going to normalize everything to 1982 values and see how 4 different things have changed over time. So the first is emissions per peak period traveler. The second is the TTI. Now, the TTI is the travel time index, and it's a widely used congestion metric, and it's essentially a reflection of normalized delay, right, with respect to free flow conditions. Right? So how much time is being, quote, wasted in congestion. The third one is total travel time per peak period traveler, and the fourth one is VMT, or vehicle miles traveled per peak period traveler. And essentially what we see is the travel time index moving in the completely different direction from the other 3. And total emissions per peak period traveler are much more closely tied to the total amount of travel per peak period traveler than the amount of delay per peak period traveler. And that makes sense if you think about the preceding slides, because the changes in efficiency at a wide range of speeds is small. So that's only going to have a marginal influence on the total emissions, whereas total emissions are very responsive to changes in the amount of travel. So the changes in VMT are clearly more reflective of changes in total emissions than simply changes in speed or changes in delay. And so, again, congestion performance measures not fully or not very well reflecting emissions changes. Looking at total emissions, this is, instead of a time series, we're looking at all the cities for, I think, 2009 in the Urban Mobility Report, or 2007 in the Urban Mobility Report. And here is the total emissions normalized to the number of peak period travelers, so total emissions per peak period traveler. On the top one, we plotted it versus TTI, which is our delay-based congestion measure. And our bottom one, we plotted it against VMT per peak period traveler. Fairly easy to see graphically that there's a much stronger relationship between total emissions and the amount of travel than total emissions and speed, or total emissions and delay. And that's because, again, the speed is only having some of these small marginal influences on the emissions, and it's the amount of travel that's really driving the total emissions value. Coming back to the Urban Mobility Report, in that report they estimate what they call the wasted fuel, and there are various issues related to how they calculate that. But more to the point of how they're presenting that conceptually, what they describe as wasted fuel is the amount of fuel that is consumed with respect to a free flow conditions with the same amount of travel demand, right? And so what they're essentially saying is they're ignoring the bottom pathway, right? They're saying the congestion effects are only reflected in changes in efficiency. So they're only looking at the top path, and then decreasing congestion levels, increase speed, decrease emissions rates, and decrease total emissions if you're only looking at the efficiency effects, but you're leaving out a lot of the impact of congestion. And then that brings me to something much more recently. This was ripped out of last week's headlines. There's a recent report that came out of Harvard Center for Risk Analysis where they were looking at the health effects of motor vehicle emissions. And this is just from a website that was talking about the report. They say emissions from traffic congestion cause 2,200 premature deaths annually. And so they're saying emissions from traffic congestion are causing that. So naturally ties into my research. I was like, well, how did they calculate the emissions from traffic congestion? What is their base case? Well, if you go in and look at the methodology, they're not actually calculating the emissions attributable to congestion. They're just calculating the total peak period emissions. Right? So really they're looking at the total amount of emissions. And so the word congestion really shouldn't be in there because they're not estimating the effects of congestion. They're estimating the total effects of emissions from vehicle travel. And I thought, well, maybe this is just a reflection of the news reporter not quite interpreting the methodology correctly. But then you go to the title of the research paper, and the title of the research paper is Evaluating the Public Health Impacts of Traffic Congestion. Right? So they're clearly suggesting that it's traffic congestion that's the problem as opposed to motor vehicle travel. And again, they're not estimating congestion with respect to any uncongested traffic state. It's simply total emissions. And that leads me to a few suggestions. Wow, I blazed through this stuff. I've got plenty of time. My tongue's tired, maybe that's why. So that leads me to some suggestions for kind of changing the way we think about congestion and the way we thinking about the relationship between congestion and emissions. So the first suggestion I have is divorcing congestion mitigation from emissions mitigation. And not thinking about these always in the same breath, and maybe programmatically. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we abolish the CMAQ program because there are a lot of good projects that have come out of that. But I'm saying think about these independently, and there are sometimes potentials for them to overlap and join together on a project. But there are also many situations in which particularly capacity-based congestion mitigation is going to increase emissions. Okay? So we can't necessarily marry these two goals or marry these two programs together. The second suggestion I have is don't assume that traffic congestion mitigations are green strategies or necessarily going to reduce emissions. There are potentials, once again, there are potential situations where congestion mitigation can reduce emissions, but it's not an inevitable result of congestion mitigation. And so unless you have done some sort of validation and some sort of an assessment, a quantitative assessment, you can't just say, well, this reduces congestion, so it must reduce emissions as well. My third suggestion relates to the way we're looking, what we're blaming our air quality problems on, and that relates to the headline on the previous slide. And I'd like to suggest that instead of thinking about it as a serial approach, S-E-R-I-L, approach where vehicle travel is causing congestion, which is causing emissions, I think we should look at it more as a parallel approach or parallel effects where vehicle travel is causing congestion and it's also causing emissions. They're both results of high levels of vehicle travel, more so than emissions resulting from congestion. And so to all you news reporters at USA Today out there, I would caution against describing the emissions effects of congestion or traffic congestion unless you're actually looking at the effects of congestion. So once again, vehicle travel causes air quality and health problems, not necessarily congestion. Although congestion plays a role, be careful with our nomenclature. And wrap it up on a positive note. There are definitely some really good opportunities for emissions reductions. Class-based strategies, class-based traffic management in particular, improving the efficiency for heavy-duty vehicles can really decrease roadway emissions. And travel demand reductions have the opportunity for, again, additive benefits where we're having reduced volume of vehicle travel and increased efficiency of vehicle travel. So there's certainly a lot of opportunities out there. And I'll say all this in the context of vehicles are getting cleaner, they're getting more efficient, and they're already becoming less responsive to congestion. With that, I'd like to acknowledge OTREC, which probably most of you all are familiar with, OCHEC for supporting this research. This is phase 2 of kind of an ongoing research effort to quantify the value of reliability. Dr. Bertini, whom many of you know, and Dr. Levinson had phase 1 a few years ago where they're looking just at the roadway impacts of reliability. And then Dr. Filiozzi, who's the PI on this project, was extending that out to broader user costs such as greenhouse gases. And I would also like to extend a personal thank you to Dr. Bertini, who was my first advisor here at Portland State and got me involved in transportation research and looking at some of the congestion issues. And thank you all again for coming and being inside on a day like this, and I'll open it up to any questions. And don't forget to use the microphones.
Thank you, Alex.
Who they always say.
For traditional internal combustion engines, what is the relationship, do you know, between gas consumption and emissions? And the reason I'm asking is because, you know, with gas at $4 a gallon, emissions are probably not going to, you know, levels of emissions are not going to change behavior in the short term, but gas consumption might.
Right. Yeah, good question. So I didn't explicitly model fuel consumption in this research that I'm presenting, although fuel consumption is very closely correlated with CO2 emissions, and particularly with final CO2 emissions. So some of the carbon is emitted as CO if it's not complete combustion, but carbon monoxide, but it does come into CO2. So the fuel speed curves look very similar to the greenhouse gas emissions curve. So I mean, it's certainly not a one-to-one. There'll be some slight differences, just as there are slight differences among the models. But it's very close to the greenhouse gas effects that you saw here, for sure. I think in the back, Ian,
could you go back to the truck-only lane slide with the 4 graphs?
Yeah.
All right, so I was kind of trying to figure this out. So, why did you put in that right-hand one when you're not going to really remove general-purpose lanes ever? And then on top of all that, you know, when you do a truck-only lane conversion, you're taking out a general-purpose lane, if that's my understanding. Now, those two should be kind of analyzed together, not separately, right? Because some of the positives will kind of cancel out, you know, with the negatives if you take out a lane, wouldn't it?
Well, the difference between 1 and 4 here are that when you remove a general-purpose lane, all the trucks are still in those other 2 lanes. With the truck-only lane conversion, we've removed the heavy-duty vehicles from those remaining 2 general-purpose lanes. So it's only light-duty vehicles remaining there. So this is, we're putting light-duty vehicles in the left 2 lanes, or we're putting light-duty vehicles in 2 lanes, heavy-duty vehicles in the 3rd lane. The 4th scenario is we put all the heavy-duty and light-duty vehicles together in just 2 lanes. So and in that case, congestion goes way up, right? Speeds go way down.
That's the kind of thing, though, is that when would a general-purpose lane ever be removed? And so why is that necessarily relevant? Because I don't see general-purpose lanes being removed from freeways ever. So
that's kind of
sure.
Yeah,
that's I'll respond to that in a couple ways. The first is that political plausibility isn't necessarily a motivator for analytical investigation, and so no reason not to model it just because it's not politically likely. Also, it really informs some of these other, it's an illustrator of some of these other effects, because you can see what's happening as congestion is going up. Some pollutants are going down because of suppressed demand. Other pollutants are going up because of decreased efficiency. And that is really a reflection of what's happening for light-duty vehicles in the truck-only lane conversion. And I think white sweater. Yeah.
Hi, I just want to say that my name is Kate Miller, and I'm relatively new to the transportation industry, but I'm working on a very interesting project that is, and I wanted to just give everybody the URL. It's and then -step, STEP -project.org, and we're putting 50 electrification stations nationally for truckers, for long-haul truckers on 5 major corridors. And we're partnering with Shore Power Technology that makes the electric pedestals, and this was interesting to me because your slide that showed how bad the emissions were from the trucks, so that, I mean, I guess the truth is we depend on trucks to get groceries and we depend on trucks to ship appliances and everything, but this was very informative, but the part that I don't understand of your conclusions is that it showed that there was a big variable, and all your studies correlated really well. With certain speeds, you get certain amount of emissions, and then you get into those slower than like 20 to 10 miles an hour, and all those emissions went up. So I don't really understand your conclusions, because it's like, how can congestion not impact on the emissions? Because you went through them really fast, and I am new to the industry, so I will apologize that I'm not always getting things that other people might get, but...
Yeah, no, I mean, let me, that's a good question, and thank you. Let me reiterate here. So this is normalized to the amount of travel. And that's really the issue, is that we're looking at the emissions rates per mile of travel, right? But you also have behavioral responses where congestion mitigation increases the amount of travel.
Oh,
right?
So if you have a higher volume, you're still getting more emissions.
In some situations. So it really depends on that trade-off. Like, is our efficiency going up more, or is our travel volume going up more? And those are the two pathways here.
Right. Well, go back to that slide, because I was thinking on the far left, the part that I don't get is that if it's 20 miles or less and the emissions are just going boom of everything, all those bad gases, doesn't that mean that when people are stuck in traffic, it's generating more pollution per travel mile? In that, I mean, especially in a commuting type situation, or...
Yes, more exactly per travel mile, and that's the issue. Is if we're normalizing to the amount of travel, then yes, our emissions are going up. But if we're looking at the total emissions, not normalizing it to the amount of travel, then it becomes more complicated. But the dominance that you see, like you said, the efficiency is going way down at very low speeds, and that's why there's good potential in this region for all these pollutants, because the efficiency dominates. But in a wide range of moderate speeds, the travel-induced demand offsets it. Okay. Thanks.
That was a really great presentation and some excellent work. So my issue is with the conversions or adding truck lanes. Aren't you rewarding the worst actors in the system? Basically, you're making life easier on the people that are contributing the most to the problem. Can't we think of a stick instead of a carrot that makes people drive off-peak, do their deliveries during times when the traffic congestion is not bad? Taxation, maybe?
Yeah, so I don't want to get too much into what policy approach we should take, but I will say that there are certainly a lot of approaches that we can take to congestion, and I want to be careful with rewarding or punishing because we all need the transportation system and we're all using it. But there are certainly some policies that are more enticing certain behaviors, and then there are certain policies that are disincentivizing other behaviors. And I think this is an example of where you have a mix of it, where by managing our lanes differently, we are changing the travel times, which is, again, it's incentivizing travel for trucks. It's disincentivizing travel for light-duty vehicles. But I didn't really talk about this. Every time I see that slide, it makes me laugh. So we didn't really talk about this, but here's our break-even point in terms of demand elasticity. And then here's the likely range from the literature of 0.2 to 1. And that's for uncontrolled demand situations where travelers are only responding to changes in travel time. If you have a congestion pricing system or a VMT tax or some sort of system like that, here the elasticity of demand is the net change in demand, right? So it's the total change in demand. So if you have some sort of a system like that, you can actually reduce the induced demand effect, and you'll have an effective lower demand elasticity. So you have a better chance of being under these curves if we have some sort of, if we have a congestion mitigation program accompanied by a congestion tax, where we're increasing efficiency, but we're also disincentivizing travel monetarily to try and have no induced demand, right? So we can kind of change our effective demand elasticity downward through some of these disincentivizing policies that you've described. Thank you. Or Kelly, did you have a question?
No.
Okay. Behind Pam?
That kind of gets to my question, which is, do heavy-duty trucks have the same elasticity levels as passenger vehicles, given that they are, traveling for work, they have very different reasons for being on the road, and they're sort of influenced by all of our consumption levels, which is a totally different model.
Right. That's an excellent question. That's something I've looked at a fair bit. So the elasticity, the demand elasticity of light-duty travel it's pretty hard to estimate, and there's a lot of uncertainty there. The demand elasticity of freight travel is ridiculously hard to estimate, and there's a ton of uncertainty there. It's for a few reasons. One, there's a lot less research on the area. There's less data available to do research because freight is primarily a private entity in this country. And there's also the issue that freight demand is influenced by many other factors, more factors, because it's influenced by everything along the supply chain. And as an example, travel time for travelers is a much larger share of their total travel costs than travel time for freight. That said, the travel time for freight is much higher than the value of travel for, the value of travel time for freight is much higher than the value of travel time for passenger travel, but still their total shipping costs, their total trucking costs are much higher. And so there's been some suggestions that the demand elasticity to travel time for freight is lower because it's such a smaller part of the total costs, right? So changes if travel time costs are only 5% of total costs for a trucker, but it's 50% of the total cost for a traveler, then the traveler is going to be more responsive to changes. And if I may, I don't know. So here I actually looked at that a little bit. So remember this slide. I said, okay, what happens if freight demand is inelastic to travel time? So either because it's intrinsically like that, or we've put some sort of a toll along with our congestion mitigation to eliminate induced demand for heavy-duty vehicles. Well, here's what the picture looks like for inelastic heavy-duty travel demand. A lot greener overall, a lot more potential for emissions reductions due to congestion mitigation if we can eliminate induced demand from the high-emitting heavy-duty vehicles. Thank you for the question and the opportunity to show my extra slide. I think Pam or did you want to follow up?
I just would like to add something that I think freight is very digital, like Alex said, and you could think about, you could just move gravel and rock or move computers. So the value of the shipment, you have like 100, terms, all the mining in terms of value. So the response, the elasticity is all over the place, and it's very, very hard. And I think Alex tried to say this. We're just trying to analyze and to understand what's going on, so like the right policy makers can make the right decisions. And there is a huge range of options, and I don't want to say that freight is guilty because it's necessary for the economy, and there are not so many options available, unfortunately, in terms of alternatives. So just wanted to make that point that we are not, just saying that it's reduce freight or freight responsible. It's just with the current technology, unfortunately, this is what our economy is depending on, the way it works. So obviously there is a lot of potential work that we could expand it, in 1,000 different ways. There is a lot of work for the people looking out there and future students.
That's Miguel Filiozzi, for a little context on that comment. Sure, Dr. McMullen.
Just quickly, I think we were talking about it too. I think that you've assumed that trucks are 10% of the traffic flow.
For some of the
Yeah. So from my experience with talking to trucking firms, if they can, they'll avoid congested time periods of the day, and they'll try to the other periods of free flow in the middle of the night.
Yep.
So that to some extent, the impact on emissions might be larger in your model if you're assuming a larger traffic flow and at those really slow speeds because you may not be traveling all the time. The other thing is, this is just a really partial equilibrium type thing. You're just looking at the impact on emissions, and there's all these other values of time and other things that could be taken into account to look at the value of reducing congestion. I think that your point that vehicle miles traveled and emissions go together is very
Thank you. Absolutely. And that's also a really good point, is that emissions is driving almost no policy with respect to congestion, right? And so when the broad congestion cost analyses that have tried to incorporate a lot of different factors, the ones that have, some of the ones that have looked at emissions have valued it very low. The ones that start to incorporate local pollutants and health impacts, it gets a fair bit higher. But still, it's really time predominantly that's driving our congestion decisions. And so I would say that the takeaway from this is not as much what our congestion mitigation policy should be, but what our emissions reductions policy should be, and how much our emissions goals should be tied into our congestion goals, or should we really just go off on our own and say, these are our emissions goals, and we're going to go after these independent of our congestion brethren. Thank you. Pam?
Well, I just had a general question. That elasticity, is that just is that including time or routes? Like, what? I'm just having a hard time. Like, what are the?
So there are, in the various studies of demand elasticity, they take into account varying scopes, right? And so the best ones take into account very indirect, very broad factors and higher order factors. So they'll take into account if there's a change on a corridor, they'll look at the change of volume of the corridor, and they'll also look at people rerouting. They'll look at demand that was induced traffic on the corridor because traffic is being diverted from other routes. They'll look at induced travel because extra trips are being made or longer trips are being made. So we'll incorporate all these. And what I was using for this analysis, one of the broad assumptions I had to make in order to keep it general is I'm looking at the net change in travel. So the net change in travel demand. And so what that's neglecting is some of the temporal and spatial redistribution of VMT that's going on in response to congestion. So we're just looking at the total change in volume, the net change in volume. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, I'll take that. After looking at your slides of the urban mobility report and the strong relationship with vehicle miles traveled, could we go back to your early slide that showed the funding priority breakdown for CMAQ? I'm curious to see what their land use priority is. Sorry, it's a really picky question. So is land use on there at all in terms of reducing miles traveled?
Let me see. So land use, can you give me an example of perhaps a project? Because this is funding projects. Like
research or regulatory measures to increase density, things like that.
Okay. That would if there have been those projects, it would probably fall under demand management. Although most of the demand management projects I saw, or maybe the ubiquitous other, most of the demand management things that I saw were telecommuting, carpooling programs, things like that. And I am not an expert on CMAQ. The list of projects is definitely available, and it would be interesting to see a more detailed breakdown of what those are.
I think when Atlanta had to form Greta over their non-compliance with air quality, they were trying to get credit for land use policies, and this was a challenge. Like, how do they fit into this funding arena, and how do they get credit for the benefits? And so I think it's something that's evolving.
One of the hard parts about doing that would be showing an expected benefit on both sides, because they've been tied together like this.
Are there any countries that show any countries that you encountered in your research that show some of these pointers you're passing out, like Germany, Europe, who have a lot of traffic problems, and obviously it's a lot different culturally than we are, like dropping out lanes or commanding certain lanes be only used by certain vehicles, and the signage that would be involved, and best practices kind of thing, like somebody to follow who would follow what you're saying.
Well, a lot of European cities are closing their city centers to motor vehicles, closing or restricting. Off the top of my head, Florence has done that. Copenhagen did that. London introduced a large fee, 8-pound fee, to the center, I believe. But related to other countries' approaches, so through a lot of this research, I say congestion mitigation, and colleagues in the U.S. typically think traffic flow improvements and capacity expansions. And I think colloquially, when we say congestion mitigation, that's really what we're talking about is capacity or throughput improvements. When I mentioned this, when I mentioned my research to colleagues in the UK, I always have to say capacity-based congestion mitigation, because congestion mitigation to them, their first assumption is that it's demand-side congestion mitigation, the one with the additive benefits, as opposed to, because they're much more restricted in their ability to add capacity than we are. And so I would say, well,
You do the freeways and they shut people out of downtown or charge them to keep their own.
I would just say that, in terms of the mental framework, they're more towards the that the travel volume is driving air quality problems more so than the congestion. That kind of what I suggest is a perhaps more accurate way of thinking about it. Any other questions? Okay. Great. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks for a great quarter. And don't forget to email me or John Glebe your either paper or your journals. Thanks.